Okay, thank you, Julianne. Well, it's a friendly, chatty group, which is wonderful. So we'll have a great session today. First thing I'd like to do, is there someone here who wants to get in touch with Susan Blanchard about Bankston? I'm sorry. Blah, blah, blah. About an art class here, watercolor class. Okay, Susan is here. If I see somebody walk in, I'll let you know. I'd like to also let you all know that we have some master gardeners here. They're here just because of Marc, I think. But anyway, so I welcome the master gardeners here. Why don't you raise your hands and then everybody can see who you are. We're great, thank you. There are some additional handouts in the back. The one you'll probably think I'm crazy because it looks like the one that we had at the first class, but I've added the Dudley Farm sale. So now you've got, I think, a list of every sale that's going on. And there's Roy. He's the one who brought it to my attention that Dudley Farm was having a sale. So it's added on this sheet. And I think now we can, well, let me just say something first before I introduce Marc. You see this plant here? Peg Owens brought it in. And this is what the master gardeners and other people do with Marc, because he's a master gardener, but he's also a master at identification of plants. And whenever the master gardeners don't know what a plant is or somebody asks them about a plant, the key word is ask Marc. So today you're going to find out more about him and what he does. Let me just tell you a little bit about him first. As I just said, he is a master gardener. He has been since 2002. And I think Mary White, who's here, was the same year, maybe as, or 3, okay. After becoming a master gardener, Marc already had his undergraduate degree. He actually got a master's degree in horticultural science from the University of Florida. And then from 2000 to 2008, he worked part-time as the assistant collections manager and extension botanist at the University of Florida Herbarium. And you'll hear more about that later also. Marc then did something what I think is very exciting. He went to Singapore, and he managed the nursery actually at the Singapore Botanic Gardens from 2008 to 2011. And then he came back home and he became the botanist at the Florida Department of Agriculture from 2011 to 2006. In July 2016, he rejoined the staff at the herbarium, where he is to this day. And the herbarium is on campus. It's in the old museum building, which is the one with the grass going up in the front. And he's there as the extension botanist, and he's there for plant identification and information, hence Peg's plant here. He has a particular interest in horticultural taxonomy, which is the classification and identification of cultivated plants. He's an encyclopedia on plants. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our guest speaker for the day, Marc Frank.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your morning to come join me, and thank you to Diane for the nice introduction and for inviting me to speak to you as part of this Great Gardener series. Let me raise this up a bit. So before we get started, eyeballs will help. You see the F button. I'm sure you can all relate to that. Before we get into today's topic, which is houseplants, I did want to tell you a little bit about the University of Florida Herbarium. A lot of people hear that word herbarium and they think it's a place where herbs are grown, but it's actually an old term for a collection of dried, pressed, preserved plant specimens. Some herbaria also had fluid preserved specimens, but we pretty much divested ourselves of fluid collections because they're much higher maintenance, and they're also considered to be a fire risk because they're usually stored in alcohol. The University of Florida Herbarium actually precedes the founding of the University of Florida. It was established in 1891 at Florida Agricultural College in Lake City. And Florida Agricultural College was the original land-grant university in the state of Florida and the site of the original Florida Agricultural Experiment Station at a time when Florida was just developing and there was massive amounts of land and a lot of people coming here to produce agricultural commodities. So the Florida Agricultural College merged with the East Florida Seminary, which was in Ocala, I believe, and that is the beginning of the University of Florida. So we were around before the University of Florida was around. So the collection consists of about 500,000 specimens. Most of them are dried, pressed, and mounted on a piece of archival paper like you see on the right here. And every specimen has a unique catalog number that functions just like the catalog number for a book in a library. It ties the data for the object with the object. Every specimen has a label that's got data on it that says what the plant is, where it came from, the type of habitat, and often a description of the plant, particularly things that might not be readily apparent from this small piece that's been sampled. So things like height or coloration that may have been lost with drying, you can record that on the sheet. So we often say in the museum world, because the herbarium is part of the Florida Museum of Natural History, that we don't just curate specimens, we actually really curate the data that is associated with the specimens. So the UF Herbarium is the oldest, the largest, and the most comprehensive botanical collection in the state of Florida. There are about 13 different herbaria in the state, about 3,400 globally, and the UF Herbarium is ranked in the top 100 in terms of size. The herbarium was a freestanding unit that was part of the Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, IFAS, for many years. But in 1981, it became part of the Florida Museum of Natural History, which made sense because all the other collections that belonged to the university that pertained to natural history were already in the museum. So the plant collections moved in as well. But we're sort of a strange hybrid. We are the only collection within the museum that still receives financial support from UF IFAS Extension, and that's because we play such a significant role in providing information to all the agricultural extension agents and natural resources agents that are located throughout the state. So our collection is an important research collection with specimens from every continent on the planet, including Antarctica, but we have a geographic focus, which is all of the areas surrounding Florida, what's known as the Circum-Caribbean region. We're also a major training ground for the botanists of the future. So we've got a lot of students working in the herbarium and then grad students at both the master's and PhD level. And then, as I already mentioned, we play an important extension function. So what I do specifically is manage basically a service for all of the extension people as well as IFAS researchers across the state. You can think of me like a reference librarian on all things botanical that is specifically serving that clientele that is then serving the broader public across the state. And this collection isn't a static entity. It's constantly growing depending on what's going on in our labor situation. We're adding anywhere between 3,500 and 6,500 new specimens per year. And I'll take this opportunity to note that we're heavily dependent on volunteers. We have a staff of 3, myself, a curator, and a collection manager. So everything we get done labor-wise is either by student employees or volunteers. At present, we have about 16 volunteers working in the herbarium. That's how Diane and I got to know each other. And she's a plant mounter. We would welcome if any of you are interested in volunteering in the herbarium. I think it's pretty fun. And we've got a variety of tasks that people can tackle. Okay, so let's move straight on to our topic of the day, which is houseplants. So you may or may not know, I'm not sure, I think younger people who are more connected with social media, and I don't dabble with social media at all, I think they're hyper aware, but houseplants are having a moment. Sales are skyrocketing, and they have been for quite some time. So just between 2017 and 2019, there was a 50% increase in houseplant sales. That's according to the National Gardening Association. And there's actually a magazine that serves all the independently owned garden centers across the country that's called Garden Center Magazine. And they do an annual survey of all these different independent nursery owners across the country. And what they found is between spring 2020 and spring 2021, which is the most recent report they've done, there was a 22% increase in houseplant sales, more than any other category of items that the nurseries were selling, such as houseplants or fruit trees or hardscape materials or pots or perennials or vegetable starts and so on. So here is some data from that survey. And what you can see is there's a whole bunch of categories: trees, shrubs, vegetables, perennials, home decor, furniture, pottery, hard goods, fountains, and houseplants led the leaderboard during this 1-year period for the first time since this survey was conducted, which it started back in the 1970s, the survey. So houseplants are super big. Generation Y and Z, which are ages 18 to 34, account for about 1/3 of all annual houseplant sales. And what's happened is the younger generation is really spending a lot of time in the digital landscape. And so between social media and things like YouTube, there is a whole group of individuals who've become known as plant-fluencers, as in plant influencers, who are driving this trend of popularity. And, you know, I used to think there were a lot of cat videos on YouTube. Like you could just go to YouTube and see, you know, people's cats doing crazy things like trying to climb the wall. But I'll tell you, there are now more plant videos on YouTube than there are cat videos. There are endless videos of people with the little GoPro cameras on their forehead, walking around giving tours of all their plants, and then people who do orders from places overseas and then video themselves unpacking the orders and talking about all the plants. There's just endless video content and online content pertaining to houseplants. Not all of it very accurate by my hardcore taxonomist standards, I might say, but a lot of content nonetheless. I'm not on Instagram, but there is a group on Instagram called Houseplant Club that has 1 million people following it, which means every time someone posts something about a houseplant, it's instantaneously going to 1 million people, which kind of blows my mind. So another metric for the popularity of houseplants is houseplant books. And it used to be in the publishing world that you were lucky if there were 3 to 5 houseplant books being published per year. Now there's 3 to 5 being published per month. If you go on to Amazon and look at houseplants under the category books and organize them by date, which you can do by publication date, you will see that there are literally dozens of books that are in pre-publication that are already lined up and are in pre-sale on Amazon. And I've seen the same thing in our local public library, that they have recently acquired massive numbers of newly published houseplant books to feed this growing public interest. Another metric is all of these startups, such as the Sill, Rooted, and Tula, which are national sales, not to wholesale, not to nurseries, but directly to consumers. So the example I'll give is the Sill, which is based in New York, and a woman named Eliza Blank at the age of 26, who had no plant experience at all. She was a marketing person, quit her job, did a Kickstarter campaign to raise $12,000, had a couple friends kick in their life savings in addition to her life savings, and she raised $32,000 to start this business, The Sill, which is selling plants via the internet across the country. And within 5 years, she was netting $5 million a year, which blows my mind. Obviously, I'm in the wrong profession if I want to get rich. And there are also, in addition to these big nationwide sales venues, there are also small shops in towns that aren't always successful in supporting independent nurseries. So I've been in Gainesville long enough to remember when we had a whole bunch of little small locally owned nurseries and the box stores weren't so dominant. And now they really can't compete. But at this point in Gainesville, we have 3 separate stores that are exclusively focusing on houseplants, which blows my mind because the small nurseries that are focusing on landscape plants can't compete, but the houseplant places can. They have specialized products like the macrame hangers and things that Home Depot and Lowe's and the other box stores don't have shelf space. And they have workshops on things like terraria, and they actually seem to be thriving, which again just gives you an idea of how houseplants have changed the horticultural landscape in this country. I'll also point out in this photo, this is, you've heard of food trucks, right? But in bigger cities like New York and Chicago, there are now plant trucks that are pulling up in different neighborhoods and plying plants so people who are living in urban environments and are riding public transportation, don't have cars, can actually go and buy specimen-sized houseplants right on the streets. And again, this just blows my mind that someone can do something like this and make a mint. Okay, so one other thing to indicate how popular houseplants are is that they're commanding premium prices. This is a page that I cut and pasted from an unnamed nursery. I will not divulge, but I'll tell you it's here in Florida. They specialize just in the aroid family. These are not mature plants, people. These are plants in 3 to 4 inch pots. And I want you to see that they're ranging in price from $1,200 for a single plant to $295. So if anything is going to make you aware, I mean, I've always bought plants, and now the popularity of them means that, oh, I'm going to be much better at propagating because I can't afford what all these young, affluent hipsters are buying. So even though this trend is being driven by that younger generation, I just want to let you know you don't have to be a hipster living in an urban area or super rich to enjoy houseplants. My grandma had houseplants. My mom had houseplants. As soon as I moved out of the dormitory as an undergraduate, I thought it was perfectly normal to have houseplants, and I've had houseplants everywhere I've lived. And I think particularly for your demographic, when your body's not quite as interested in getting out and doing hardcore gardening, that houseplants are a way that you can maintain your interest and have something to care for and enhance the aesthetics of your living space. So I actually think the demographic where the houseplant trend could really show some growth is the older demographic. And the person who figures out how to bring plants to the older generation are the people who are going to really drive this trend further. The younger people, as usual, have a short attention span and they'll move on to something else. But, like I said, my grandma, my mom's 94 and she's still got houseplants, so. Okay, so that's about the trend of houseplants. Let's talk about the factors that influence how we can succeed in growing houseplants. So first and foremost is sunlight, then the growing media, what you're growing the houseplants in, what type of container you're using, water and humidity, fertilizer, and most importantly, plant selection. And so I'm going to talk about each of these variables individually. The important thing to remember is that there's really no one-size-fits-all recipe. What you do for an African violet is not necessarily the same as what you're going to do for a tropical understory plant like a philodendron, and is not necessarily what you do for an orchid or a cactus. They have different requirements. So you need to do some thinking about what the plant is exposed to in its natural habitat, and then try and approximate it in your indoor setting. Each home and each room within the home has different environmental conditions that affect plant performance. And I've really learned this kind of the hard way because I just put plants in front of every window and thought they would all perform equally. And I'll talk more about that in just a second. So the first factor that I mentioned is light, and light's really essential to photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process by which plants produce their own food. We refer to fertilizer as plant food, but it's really not. It's mineral supplements that help the plant to run its metabolism, build cells. Plants actually make their own calories in the form of sugars, which they store as carbohydrates through this process of photosynthesis. And light is the driver of photosynthesis. So insufficient light means less photosynthesis, which means less growth. And particularly if you're talking about a plant with large leaves or big flowers, lower photosynthesis is usually going to mean poor performance. Plant growth and metabolism is strongly influenced by three different factors of light. One is the intensity or strength, which is usually measured in a unit called lux or foot candles. And what 1 foot candle equals 10.76 lux. Another aspect of light is the spectrum or wavelength, which is measured in nanometers. And plants use different wavelengths of light for different functions. So you've all seen the light spectrum with ultraviolet, infrared, red, orange, yellow, green, into the blue and purple and so on. So the red and blue light wavelengths play the greatest role in photosynthesis, but then other wavelengths play a greater role in the development of flowers or fruit, for example. And then another aspect of light is the duration, that is the relative length of daylight versus dark. And that plays a very important role in the initiation of flowers in many plant species. So you may have noticed, particularly the master gardeners in this audience, that certain plants will only bloom in the fall or winter. You can never, no matter how hard you try and how much fertilizer you give them, you can't get them to bloom in another time. And it's that shortening day length. For example, poinsettias, there's a good reason that we see poinsettias in the late fall and winter, because they're a short day plant. It is the diminishing of day length relative to dark period that initiates flower formation. So the light needs of each plant species vary, and obviously plants that are understory species have very different light requirements from those that are out in the desert and exposed to sunlight with no shade whatsoever for the entire length of the day. So here's a little handy chart that was put together by UF-IFAS Extension at this link, and I will make this presentation available to Diane that she can share with anyone who's interested. And it's just breaking down some common houseplants into low light, medium light, and high light categories, and then telling you what intensity over on the left-hand side, so low light plants are considered to be 50 to 250 foot candles, medium 250 to 1,000, and high light over 1,000 foot candles, and then telling you some examples of different commonly cultivated houseplants that fall into those categories. So some important things to consider when you're growing plants indoors is that windows typically reduce light intensity anywhere from 30 to 50%, depending on the thickness of the pane of glass. Light intensity is then further reduced about 10% for each foot that you move away from the window. There's a significant difference in light intensity in windows on different sides of the house, with windows on a southern or western exposure generally having much higher light intensity than those on the northern or eastern side of a home. And then light intensity is further impacted by factors like trees in the surrounding landscape, roof overhang, whether there's a screen on the window, and so on. So this little handy dandy object on the right side of the screen is a light intensity meter. And when I was preparing this presentation several years ago, I thought, you know, I'm a scientist. I need to figure out what's going on. So I bought one of these for $30-something on Amazon. I did a little research on what was recommended. And then I went to this picture window that's on the north side of my house. And this looks out on my backyard. And there's a nice cement patio that's in full sun where I grow a lot of plants. And so I went out on a sunny summer day around 1 o'clock, and I took some measurements. And so on the patio, 10 feet outside of that window, I measured over 11,000, almost 12,000 foot candles, which is good high light intensity. When I was just 3 feet out of the window under the overhang, the light intensity dropped significantly by, almost 11,000 foot candles. And that's just getting up adjacent to the house, not even inside the house yet. When I put the light meter directly against the window on the outside, the light intensity dropped to 600 foot candles. When I moved directly inside the window against the pane of glass, it dropped to 380 foot candles. When I moved 1 foot in from the window, it dropped to 310 foot candles. And when I moved 3 feet back from the window, it dropped to 2 30-foot candles. So what I realized is that the plants that I was growing on this desk in front of this window, I was starving them to death. They weren't getting enough light to photosynthesize, which is why they looked spindly. So the conclusions with regard to light is that it's really the primary factor that affects how we succeed with houseplants. If something's, excuse me, not going right with a houseplant, the first thing you should look at is what kind of plant is it and how much light is it getting. Although some plants do tolerate low light, over time, suboptimal light results in reduced growth, a lanky, kind of stretched out habit, sparse foliage, reduced flowering, and a greater likelihood that you'll have pest and disease problems because plants that are not photosynthesizing well have a weakened immune system and are less resistant to pests and diseases. The good news is that grow lights have become increasingly more affordable. And when I took that light meter around my house and realized that every darn window in my house was in the low light category, I went online and started researching grow lights. And in the old days, grow lights were expensive and they were hot. So if you put them too close to the plant, they would burn the plant. Well, what's happened now is there's been this massive interest in LED technology, which is not only energy efficient, but puts out very little heat. And what's driven this is partly the interest in growing plants in outer space. You may know that they're growing plants in the space station and on the shuttles, but also there's this massive interest in growing medicinal cannabis indoors. And all of this LED technology was developed for that. And then also indoor vegetable production. And so this has trickled down to the homeowner level where if you go onto a website like Amazon, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of different choices from interconnected tubes to, clip-ons, all different types of things with like goosenecks that you can really adapt to your particular growing situation. So I was somewhat unleashed at this point and have gradually accumulated more and more grow lights. And I have to say, my plants are looking so good. So it's just changed my ability to grow plants indoors. And what happened is I'm a plant whore. I'll just say it right here. And so I am particularly prone to growing plants that do not want to grow in Gainesville, Florida. They want to grow in Costa Rica or Brazil. And so then wintertime arrives and there is this very harsh reminder that I don't live in Costa Rica or Brazil. And so traditionally before the grow lights, what I do is move the plants indoors and they'd kind of suffer and dwindle, and I just barely make it through our brief 2 to 3 month winter. Then I'd move them back outside. But now with the grow lights, I can move these tropical plants indoors for the winter. And then late March, April rolls around and I'm like, they look so good. Maybe I don't need to move them back out. And it's just a real game changer. So even if you just invest in one and you have one spot that you grow plants, I highly recommend that you look into these LED grow lights because you can buy a LED fixture for $20 or less. Okay, so we're moving on to another factor. I won't spend as much time on the others as light, but growing media is basically a mixture of different components, and each component contributes different properties to the mix in terms of its pH, its ability to hold nutrients, its texture, how well drained it is, moisture retention, aeration, and so on. So different types of plants require different mixes. It's just like I said before, there isn't one size fits all. The magic is really in the mix. The one thing I will tell you is that garden soil, what you dig out of the landscape, generally produces poor results in a container-grown plant. Bagged media, on the other hand, have been pasteurized to kill pests and weed seeds and insect eggs, and they are especially formulated to have that mix of components that ensures that both commercial growers and home growers will have success trying to grow containerized plants. And there is a subcategory of bagged mixes known as professional mixes that have higher proportions of peat and sphagnum, which are expensive products. So you might be tempted to buy the $1 or $1.99 bag of potting mix at Walmart, the cheapy bag. But I tell you, you get much better results when you go for the $10 or $12 bag, because it's got more of those expensive products that really give the plants what they need to succeed. And as I mentioned, different plant species require different media with different properties. So it doesn't mean that you need to buy 10 different mixes if you're growing cacti and orchids and foliage plants and so on. What I do is I buy one professional mix, but then I have some other products. I have a small bag of perlite and a small bag of vermiculite, and I have some small chipped wood bark. And if I know that I'm potting up some succulents, for example, I'll add in some additional handfuls of perlite to increase the drainage and porosity to give that plant a greater likelihood of surviving without getting bogged down in too much moisture retention. Okay, so that's media. Let's move on to container selection. The important thing to realize about containers is there's actually a moisture gradient within the container. And this is logical because you know that water moves downward. So if you've got a pot full of soil, when you water it, the water filters through towards the bottom. So the lowest water content is at the top of the plant and the highest at the bottom of the plant. And then going back to the container media with coarser, larger particles has a smaller saturation zone at the bottom of the pot relative to media with finer grained particles. And then pot size also has impact on how large the saturation zone is at the bottom of the pot. So you may have seen those short, squat pots, sometimes referred to as bulb pans. Well, bulb pans, as you'll see there, the saturation zone reaches almost half the height of the pot. That's on the bottom image, the pot on the right. You can see the blue extending halfway up. That means if you have a plant that's a real water lover, you want to put it in a shorter, squatter plant to ensure that the roots are closer to the moisture. And conversely, if you have a plant that really requires perfect drainage, a taller, narrower pot, it's going to ensure that the roots are perched above that saturation zone of all the water that accumulates at the bottom of the pot. And then there's something my mom used to do, and I think a lot of people do, which is to put gravel or broken shards of old pots in the bottom of the pot, thinking that it helped with drainage. And that's a wives' tale. That's a no-no. University-based research has really shown that when you put that different coarser material in the bottom of the pot, it actually impedes drainage. And so what you want to do is fill the pot all the way to the bottom. A lot of times people are concerned about the soil running out of the pot, particularly for an indoor growing situation. And so if that's the case, you might want to put a small piece of like poly window screen to cover the hole so that the particles aren't going out, but you don't want to put rocks or shards of pottery. Okay, so moving on to watering and humidity. As I've mentioned with each of these other factors, different species have different soil moisture and humidity requirements. Most foliage plants
are tropical understory plants from forests that have a very humid environment. That canopy overhead actually holds the moisture and the rain filters through. And so they want a much more humid environment than our bodies might be comfortable in. So what is a houseplant lover to do? You can put plants on trays of pebbles that you've got water underneath. You can mist. You can get a small humidifier. Particularly in the winter months when we're running a heater, it's really sucking the moisture out of the air in our homes. And the result is that we start to see those brown edges on all our houseplants. And so just positioning a small humidifier near the area where you're growing plants is going to help the plants, but also if you're prone to dry skin in the winter months like I am, then you'll also find that the humidifier is going to help with that as well. Now, the other strategy you can take is to select plants that do better and are more tolerant of lower humidity conditions. So plants with thicker leaves and a thicker, waxier cuticle on the outer surface of the leaves are more likely to withstand suboptimal humidity without showing those brown edges and without suffering. And conversely, very thin textured leaves are more likely to suffer in suboptimal humidity. And as I mentioned, you can boost humidity by placing plants on trays of pebbles, grouping plants together, because when they're closer together, it creates a little humid microclimate, using a hand mister, just a little spray bottle with a pump. So during the winter months when all my babies are inside, I'm doing a lot of misting, and I've got spray bottles by each of the shelves that has grow lights. And so it's easy for me before I leave for work in the morning to just do spritz, 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 and with humidifiers. Also realize that water needs vary during the year. So winter, typically with cooler temperatures and shorter days, is not an active growing period for a lot of plants, and therefore their water needs are diminished. And then conversely, in the summer months when we're at peak daylight like we are now and temperatures are on the increase, plant metabolism is also on the increase and the water needs increase. So just because you've got a plant that you're watering once a week in June doesn't mean you need to water it once a week in December. You might be able to get away with watering it much less often in the winter months. So the other thing is that a lot of people are coddlers. They want to just do a little, like, oh, I'm just going to give the smallest little drink to my plant. And that doesn't really fully saturate the entire pot. The best way to water is less frequently, but more heavily, to encourage deep roots in the pot. If you water with a very small amount, it encourages shallow roots, which means if you go on vacation and you're away from the plant for 10 days, it's more likely to suffer during your absence. So you want deep roots. And then what I do with my way too many plants is I periodically take them outdoors or put them in the bathtub back when I was an apartment dweller and fully saturate them. So I would use the water from the tub or the shower and saturate them to the point the water was freely flowing from the bottom of the pot. And when I take a plant outside, like I often do this in the fall, just before I start to move plants inside for the winter, is that I'll group them and just water the heck out of them. And then they'll be able to go for 2 to 3 weeks after I've moved them indoors before I need to start doing some hand watering. So good saturation can go a very long way. I don't really recommend doing it in your kitchen sink like you see here. If you're a fastidious housekeeper like I am, it makes a big fat mess and a lot of soil in your drain. Okay, so with fertilizer, just a reminder that fertilizer isn't plant food. It's a form of mineral nutrients that support physiological processes and the building blocks for plant molecules. They're not a source of calories. Plant makes their own calories and they grow as a result of photosynthesis. And just a little reminder from your high school or college science class, photosynthesis is the process by which a couple molecules of carbon dioxide are combined with a couple molecules of water, and through the alchemy of sunlight are converted into a single sugar molecule and some extra molecules of oxygen. And that's why we have this fabulous atmosphere on planet Earth that supports us all and all the other living things on this planet, is because we have plants here that are producing the oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis. Next time you see a plant, be sure to thank it for the air you breathe. When we're talking about fertilizer, there's two groups of nutrients. There's the macronutrients, the most important. These are nitrogen, potassium, and help me, phosphorus, thank you, as well as calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Don't forget carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, very important photosynthesis. So those are all the macronutrients. And then the micronutrients include iron, manganese, boron, molybdenum, copper, and zinc. And what you'll see in this wonderful extension chart on the right is there's actually an optimal soil pH at which these different nutrients are absorbed. And so the optimal absorption for most average house plants, for most plants in general, is between 5.4 and 6.4, which is slightly on the acidic side of neutral, though I will say that it really depends on the plant, and some plants are adapted to alkaline environments, and you would need to do something to increase alkalinity in the potting mix if you were growing those. And so each nutrient plays a different role in plant physiology and growth, with imbalances affecting not just the way the plant grows, but it's going to affect the soil pH and the accumulation of soluble salts. So you guys may have seen that crusty white stuff that accumulates on the inside of the pot. And those are soluble salts, and they are much more likely to accumulate on the pot when there is an incorrect pH or you're not watering heavily enough. And then that incorrect pH and soluble salts impact the way the plant grows and performs. So you got different choices in terms of fertilizer. There's that old school blue stuff, the granular stuff like Peters or Miracle-Gro that you'd mix with water. It is inexpensive but short acting, and it often leaches very quickly out of the bottom of the pot. So there's granular fertilizer that you don't mix with water that you can just sprinkle on the surface. There's the kind that you mix with water. The kind that you mix with water might be good if you've got a plant that's really looking yellow and in need of nitrogen. You might be able to spray the leaves and green it up. A lot of people want to go with organic fertilizers because they're concerned about the environment, or they don't want to have a lot of chemicals inside their home. But what you need to realize about organic fertilizers is they generally have lower nutrient levels, and they require some microbial action to convert the nutrients into a form that the plants can use, so they're not particularly fast acting. And then there are controlled release fertilizers. Those are the ones that are in little resin pellets like Osmocote or Nutricote. And these are more expensive products, but they're longer lasting, and they provide a reliable gradual availability of nutrients depending on the rating. So there are 3-month, 6-month, 9-month, and 12-month formulations of these various pelleted fertilizers. And so for houseplants, I don't want to be mixing up blue fertilizer every couple of weeks. So when I pot up the plants, I just sprinkle some Osmocote in the pot at the root zone, and then I never use a granular or water-soluble fertilizer at all. What they say, you may have seen on fertilizer bags that there's usually 3 numbers on the bag. That's those 3 big, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the NPK. And so they say a ratio of 3 parts of nitrogen to 1 part of phosphorus to 2 parts of potassium is usually recommended for foliage plants. And then for flowering plants like orchids, hibiscus, African violets, and so on, they recommend a higher proportion of the phosphorus relative to the other two. And then just like with water, realize that fertilizer needs are usually lower in the winter under conditions of lower light and lower temperatures. So you might be in the habit of fertilizing a plant every month in the summertime, but you can probably step off that in the winter months, because if you don't, you're more likely to get that accumulation of dissolved salts on the inside rim and mess up the pH. And then our last factor is plant selection. So the trick is to try and select species that match your growing conditions in your room. And so if you've got a real sunroom with glass walls on all sides and, skylight, and it's really phenomenal light, you might be able to select plants from those highlight categories. But most of us aren't so fortunate. And so we need to lower our expectations and go with the medium and low light plants. I don't try to grow any fruit trees or hibiscus or vegetables in my home because I can't give them enough light. I'm growing many more foliage plants and just barely eking by with African violets. I don't do any succulents. I mean, think about it. Succulents are out in high light. So there's a lot of things that people sell as houseplants, but it's really hard to succeed with them unless you're giving them a lot of supplemental light. So the biggest factor that affects how you succeed is what plant you choose and whether it matches the growing conditions where you want to grow it. You got a bathroom with no windows at all, you better pick the toughest, lowest light plant. Only thing I can think of is mother-in-law's tongue, and it might last for a few months, but eventually it wants to get some light. So tropical understory plants, what are sold as foliage plants, are often well suited to those lower light conditions that we have indoors, but they do often have higher humidity requirements, which means that if you can get away with a lower light, but you need to do something to supplement the humidity like we talked about earlier. And an example of this, has anyone seen this plant before? This is the rattlesnake calathea. Wendy Wilbur, our old Master Gardener coordinator, gave me a plant of this years ago. And I was growing it indoors, and it always get all these brown edges on it. And I was like, what is up? Why can't I make this plant look good? And then when I realized that it was an understory plant and it wanted humidity, I moved it onto a window seat where I have a bunch of plants clustered together. And in the winter months, that is one of those areas that I spritz daily. And no more brown edges, bye-bye brown edges. So I just had to do some thinking about what those symptoms were telling me that the plant wanted. So as I mentioned, most flowering plants and succulent plants have very high light intensity requirements. That means really good direct sunlight outside of the window or very high quality supplemental lighting. And so really what I'm talking about is called holistic houseplant care. And one of the big plant influencers is Daryl Chang, who wrote this book called The New Plant Parent, which is a phenomenal reference. And what Daryl said is a holistic approach to indoor plant care should focus on giving plant a suitable environment inside your home, that is, matching it to the needs of the plant based on the habitat it comes from, observing the plant to assess its needs rather than just blindly following a habitual, like I water every week. Instead, look at the plant, stick your finger in the soil. Is it dry or not? And then giving it water in response to that. And then understanding and accepting the life cycle of the plant. Just like we're losing and shedding hair and skin cells off our bodies, plants are going to have leaves that turn yellow and die. Every plant does it. Every tree loses leaves. Every blade of grass dries. So people see a brown leaf on their plant and they freak out. And it's just like, groom it, pluck it off. It is normal, unless you're seeing it happen on all the leaves, particularly it's the lower leaves, right? It's the lower, older leaves will start to be shed. That is a normal process, and we got to accept it. Okay, so there's one other thing I wanted to point out, and that is the photo on the upper right. You guys may recognize those as tillandsias or air plants. And one of my biggest pet peeves is that people will put tillandsias in little empty seashells and put magnets on the back and then sell them as refrigerator magnets. Tillandsias grow high in the canopy, typically very close to the equator. So they are super high intensity light plants. Can you imagine any area in your home that is lower light than the front surface of the refrigerator? This is just torture. When people do this, when I see it, it just freaks me out. I'm like, obviously, anyone who is doing this, and who can clip a fluorescent light onto the front of your fridge, right? This is just out and out torture. The other thing that I'll mention is, just because you can't succeed with a certain type of houseplant, don't give up, because there are different cultivars. So you guys may be familiar with crotons. They're a landscape plant with waxy, colorful foliage, and they're grown a lot in the landscape, particularly when you get Orlando to Tampa and southward. Up in Gainesville, not so much. People plant them out and we lose them in the winter, but crotons are tough. They have that waxy foliage. And so I kept trying to get some of the cooler old heirloom crotons and grow them in front of that picture window you saw. And every time they just suffered, and they dropped leaves, and they just got spindly, and eventually they died. And I was like, I can't grow crotons. I just gave up. And then when I started reading about crotons, I realized that there was a cultivar, a specific one called Eburneum, not quite as colorful, but still pretty attractive to my eye. And because of that yellow and gray, it's got a much lower light requirement. And a very kind master gardener in Brevard County heard me talking about this cultivar, and she said, I'm going to bring you one of those. And she brought me an Eburneum, and I've had it growing in front of that picture window for like 3 years now. So I failed with many different crotons, but I found the right one that was tolerant of my conditions and was able to succeed. So don't just say, oh, I can't grow X. You just need to find the right cultivar of X and think about what X really needs. And so now I know we're getting short on time, but I just want to blast through a couple of categories. I work more than full time. I'll divulge here that I'm a workaholic, and I often spend 50 hours or more in the herbarium. So I don't have a lot of time in my home to baby plants. So I need the toughest of the tough. And these things that I'm going to highlight are the things that Marc can neglect and still look good. And I'll mention that the overwhelming majority of the photos that I'm providing here are all glamour shots that I took of my own plants. So I brought home a piece of black velvet fabric and set up my plants and did like little studio shots, like I was taking photo of a supermodel. Was a lot of fun. So I'm kind of proud of all the glamour shots of my different babies. So one of the categories of plants I really like are Chinese evergreens. It's a group of Asian species, and they all have colorful foliage. They're super tolerant of low light, and they don't mind drying out at all. There's a lot of breeding. The old aglaonemas often had silver coloration, but what's happened is some really ingenious breeders in Southeast Asia have bred this species and gotten a bunch of things that have pink and red coloration in the leaves. And so there's a whole new generation of Chinese evergreens that are super sexy looking. And there are literally dozens and dozens of cultivars available that are really tough. Another group of plants I love is the philodendrons. This is an enormous genus of plants that are native to the American tropics, and they range from the vining type to the cascading type, to the ones that are self-heading, that are like a rosette of leaves. And philodendrons are by and large tropical understory plants, so more tolerant of low light. The vining ones are usually going up towards the light, so they will have slightly higher light requirements than the understory ones. Lots of different philodendrons to choose from, and lots of different philodendron cultivars and hybrids available now. Zamioculcas, the ZZ plant. This plant is tough as nails. I've seen it growing in full direct sunlight in Miami all day long, and I've seen it in the dense shade of someone's bathroom. It's got very succulent stems and succulent leaves, which means it's able to handle almost anything you dish out to it. And now there's some new cultivars like the variegated one that you see on the left. That's not one of my glamour shots. I wish I had that plant over there. And this isn't my plant either. This is the cultivar Raven that comes from Costa Color down in Miami. But there's lots of different ZZ plants coming on the market now because people have realized how tough they are. Begonias. One of my plant mentors was Rick Schulhorn, whom some of you may be familiar with. And Rick has been trialing a whole bunch of rhizomatous begonias for landscape use. And when he started accumulating begonias, I started getting cuttings from him and trying them for indoor use. And there's an amazing diversity of begonias. It's one of what's considered to be a mega genus of flowering plants with about 2,000 species, many, many thousands of cultivars that are hybrids. And so these range from the old angel wing types, which are growing on upright canes, the ones with rhizomes, all different foliage patterns. A lot of these are thinner textured leaves, which means they want higher humidity. The thicker the leaves are, the better adapted they are to indoor growing situations. Peperomias. Peperomias are tough plants, thick succulent leaves that make them more tolerant of lower watering. Again, this is a very large genus, native mostly to the American tropics, but extending into the warm temperate areas and a little bit in the old world. And again, there's many different cultivars. They usually want some higher light, but low water. Oops, wrong direction. Hoyas. I used to just grow the old-fashioned Hoya with the pink clusters of flowers, or the Hindu rope Hoya, but Hoya is a really big genus of old world tropic plants, and some of them have enormous flowers. Like, look at this photo here. That's my hand behind this flower. So what you can see is that an individual flower is as big as the palm of my hand. And so there's all different types of Hoyas. A lot of them are fragrant at night because they're pollinated by sphinx moths. And so in an indoor setting, if you can bring them into bloom, you'll often get these sweet aromas drifting in. And so now I've got a whole collection of Hoyas that I grow outdoors under my carport in the winter months, in the summer months, but in the winter months, they all move indoors and hang from the rafters in my Florida room. And the nice thing about Hoyas is they are mostly from areas with very seasonal rainfall. So when I move my Hoyas indoor for the winter, they get zero water for 2 to 3 months. They just hang from those rafters, and they are perfectly okay for the entire duration of winter. And then I move them back out once the danger of frost has passed in March, and they resume growth. And there might be a few branches that die that I have to trim back, but it's absolutely wonderful to have a plant that you can move indoors for winter and never have to water. That's my kind of plant care. Dracaena. Dracaena is a mostly African genus, and it includes that old-fashioned corn plant that people used to grow, but there are lots of other different Dracaenas, some of which have, to my eye, really attractive foliage patterns. And so now I'm really into the genus Dracaena, and someone sends me a photo of a Dracaena that I haven't seen before or aren't growing, and I'm like, give me a cutting. I need a cutting of this. So I'm on Dracaena quest now. You can never have enough of them, and they're tough. Sansevieria, these are the mother-in-law's tongues, and most of us grew up with someone growing a mother-in-law's tongue, but this is an enormous genus and all different forms. These plants are really closely related to the Dracaenas in the previous slide, and actually the taxonomists are saying they should be merged into one genus, which makes all the Sansevieria enthusiasts mad with rage. They don't want it to be subsumed into Dracaena, but I believe the taxonomists. But just like I've gone gaga on Dracaenas, I've gone gaga on Sansevierias because I can move these things indoors and not water them for months, and they look great. And as long as they're getting good light, hence the indoor LED lights that I was talking about, I can move some of these really sexy frost-sensitive mother-in-law's tongues indoors for the entire duration of winter, and they keep growing and looking fabulous. And so for more information, if you think that you might have the houseplant bug, UF IFAS has some great information on their Gardening Solutions website. There are some books that I highly recommend. The old-fashioned one that I've had since I moved out of my mom's house in the early 1980s was a Reader's Digest book called Success with Houseplants, and it's still around. The Houseplant Expert is an older book that's really great. I had mentioned Daryl Chang's The New Plant Parent, which is the best of this new crop of books that's come out. It's really excellent. He's an engineer by training, and he takes a scientist approach to growing plants. He's also a very talented photographer. And then the book that the professionals are using to produce houseplants in a greenhouse or nursery setting is called Tropical Foliage Plants by Lynn Griffith. And this is the Bible for all the foliage plant producers down in the Apopka area and Homestead who are growing these professionally. There's also some UF IFAS documents that are available online. And with that, I know we're short on time, but any questions, I'm happy to entertain them in front of the microphone or individually.
Thank you. Thank you. Mark, you're wonderful. Okay. Let me get to you with the mic for questions.
Just curious, how long does the soil last when you repot and keep it fresh?
That's an excellent question. So the primary component that breaks down is the sphagnum peat, the more fibrous material. So it really depends on the mix that you're using. The less expensive mixes that have more bark and wood last longer than the ones that are higher in sphagnum. But the sphagnum is the thing that contributes the most acidity. And you remember that I said there was an optimal pH for nutrient absorption. So for a lot of those understory plants that are in environments that have a lot of humus in the soil, those are generally high acid soils. And so those need to be replenished more often. It also depends on the size of the pot. So you can often actually visually observe and also feel when the soil is breaking down because it starts to become more uniform in texture and finer. And you'll notice when you water that water is not draining through as well. So there's some cues that help to tell you. Usually, I think that the components of the soil don't break down as quickly as the plant outgrows the size of the pot. And so what's often driving repotting for me is that I want to give the baby a bigger space to grow into. And at that time, then I'm upping the amount of soil. So I'm not actually replacing the soil per se, but placing the soil in the smaller, older pot inside a larger pot, and maybe breaking up the root ball slightly, but not a wholesale replacement of the soil. But it's a very good question. And for something like a cactus mix, which is a lot of bark and perlite and sand, those components might last for many years relative to a tropical foliage mix, which is very fine and moisture retentive. Thank you.
Other questions? Well, I know that Mary White has an invitation. Oh, is there? And okay, sorry. Whoops. Wait just a second.
So she's
Yeah,
asking
this.
if I'll just translate. She's asking if a person can visit the herbarium. And at present, we are not allowed to have visitors to the herbarium because there are still collections that are stored in alcohol. And the fire marshal has said that our building is a heightened risk. So in the old days, those of you who've been in Gainesville a long time remember that we used to have a collections open house where people could visit the museum and wander behind the scenes. Scenes of heads nodding, and it was so much fun. And then the fire marshal was like, you people can't do that. We've never had a fire in the museum. So anyways, what's happening now, if you've been driving around anywhere near 34th Street in the Butterfly Rainforest, you may have noticed that a building popped up behind the Butterfly Rainforest and the Harn, and that is the Florida Museum's new Fluid Collections building. So as we speak, there are busybodies moving specimens in fluid out to that building, and we're hoping eventually when all the alcohol collections, which are the mollusk and gastropods and a lot of the amphibians and reptiles and fish and so on, when they are all moved, that the fire marshal may allow us to once again be open to the public, and we may actually get to do our collections open house again. I used to be able to give tours to Master Gardener groups or groups like, a group from Oak Hammock or Garden Club, and now whenever I ask, they tell me no. So hold tight. Maybe there is a tour happening in the future. Yes, Roy.
I had a comment about the beginning with your history. The East Florida Seminary was indeed in Ocala before the Civil War. But after the war,
Went to
when it was
Micanopy.
closed, it moved to Gainesville. And you can actually see the building. It's encapsulated in the First Methodist Church downtown. I think that part of it's called Epworth Hall. I'm not sure. The first building built there was frame and burned, but the second building, as I say, you can actually see. And a byproduct of that, which is important to us, was that Herman Herzog's son taught chemistry there, which is why we have all these wonderful Herman Herzog paintings of Florida in the winter over at the Harn, there elsewhere in the state. But that's just a matter of university history, which I think is interesting.
I think it's interesting too. It's interesting because when I was looking up that factoid, there are a number of things that were referring to East Florida Seminary or something with a similar name in Micanopy.
There was one in Bartow that was part of the mix. I'm not sure about Micanopy.
And so then I heard, it's hard to get at all the details, and sometimes there are small things that happen, little interim, just like our extension office moved from being over by the airport out to the Newberry area, but in the interim, they were in a trailer in Jonesville, and you kind of wonder, was there something that happened in any kind of transition between Ocala and Gainesville? Because I've had people tell me, oh, no, it wasn't in Ocala, it was in Micanopy. And when I looked online, I looked at both, but I believe that the original was you know.
Well, I'm doing research now on Florida Southern for a talk in ILR a couple of terms from now. And I read in one place that Florida Southern began in Micanopy. Now, it had 4 or 5 other locations before it settled in Lakeland. So you could have found a reference to something in Micanopy that actually was the first Florida Southern.
It's possible.
Great. Other questions? Okay. I just like to say one thing, that if you do have stuff that you want tested, either your house plants or out in our gardens here, you can get your soil tested through the Extension Service. So if you are interested, just let me know.
The very important thing to note to follow up on that is they run different tests on container media versus landscape. So you need to really specify that it's something for container plants, not for landscape plants, if you do request a soil test.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Roy.
Yeah, yes, yes. And now I've received a note from Mary White, who was with us 2 weeks ago. And she said, do you think the MGs, the Master Gardeners who are here, like to take a 5-minute tour through my apartment sunroom? So if you think you would like to, Mary, stand up. I think we all know you. Great. But just... Okay. Okay.